Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Hey, it's your hosts, Em and Jay. And today the two of us are talking about the relatively recent trend of taking villain characters and making them more heroic, and what that ends up doing to the characters that were already heroic. The two of us watched all the available episodes of Netflix Carmen Sandiego, and in it they took a very iconic villain, and they made her more heroic. Carmen has an entirely new backstory that's oddly enough very similar to Adora's backstory from She-Ra, which was also recently rebooted on Netflix only about 2 months ago. I know Adora's backstory has been around since the 80s, but it's still kind of weird. They're made by two different companies, so I'm not really sure how that ended up happening, but it is strange. In her new backstory, she was discovered as a baby on the side of the road in Argentina and taken to an island of villains and thieves, where she's taught that thieving is basically a game, and she's unaware of how evil they truly are, like how they're willing to kill in order to get ahead. When she does find out the truth, she's horrified by this information, so she decides to use her skills that they taught her in order to bring them down. She ends up becoming the biggest threat to their empire. This is obviously a huge departure from traditional Carmen Media, where she was both the founder and the leader of Vile. Carmen Media usually had its own canon, and sometimes she was portrayed as a little more villainous, sometimes a little less villainous, even kind of like an anti-hero. But she was never portrayed as being an outright monster. Her main goal was just the thrill of the chase. She loved the hunt, and she never went out of her way to hurt people. There were times when she would steal pretty important things like the entire history of medicine, which would of course hurt people, but she never directly killed anyone. She was just in it for the fun. On the other side, there was ACME, which was a detective agency whose goal was to help people, and their main concern was Carmen. She was originally an ACME agent who betrayed them, and ultimately I think it shows how selfish she really was, because she was mostly in ACME just for the thrill of it, and when she thought it wasn't fun anymore, she ditched them to start her own evil organization and prove she was better than the rest by committing these capers and always staying one step ahead, the way the villains she faced were never able to. I am glad that they committed to this idea once they decided to go for it. I think that the audience does feel for Carmen, and they are rooting for her. It's good that we're shown that she is the biggest threat to Vile, and that they recognize that. They're sending their operatives after her, and we do get to see her relationship with her former classmates and her former instructors, and how complicated that can be. It can be a refreshing new take to the Carmen Sandiego franchise. The problem is that they ended up sacrificing ACME in order to make this happen, and we feel that they didn't have to sacrifice ACME to do this. If they're going to take villain characters and make them more heroic, where does that leave the characters that were already heroic? They need to find a new place in the story if they're gonna keep them around at all. This typically results in the hero characters being portrayed as more incompetent than they had been before. The first characters we're introduced to are Chase Devino and Jules Argent. Both were former partners of Carmen Sandiego back when she was with ACME, but from different games. I'm glad that they have these references to the games and the TV shows, but here they're working for Interpol instead of ACME. They're talking about the recent string of robberies done by Carmen and have located her in the area of Poitiers, France. Jules is theorizing about Carmen's next target, and Chase slams on the brakes out of nowhere and starts yelling at her, basically saying that she's boring and not helping. This is how we're introduced to his character. He basically ends up being the one that's most sacrificed. He's rude, abrasive, mean, constantly putting down his partner or talking over her, and ultimately pretty incompetent at his job. Like when Jules spots Carmen close by to their vehicle, he pursues her but refuses to call for backup and even tells Jules to stay put so that way he can chase her himself. I guess he just wants all the glory to himself, but the scene ends up being really disappointing disappointing because the entire point of Carmen Sandiego was the thrill of the chase, how she was always so close yet just out of reach, but it always seemed like next time we would catch her. But here, she's just too far out of his league when it comes to being athletic and when it comes to skills. He ends up pursuing her over the rooftops of the town. Instead of one step ahead of him, she ends up being leagues ahead of him, and it's really obvious that she's going to get away. After losing Carmen on the rooftops, he manages to deduce that she's going to the train station. He continues to chase her by himself, refusing to call for backup even when his car runs out of gas, despite the fact that he knows which train she's on and could easily call for Interpol to intercept the train before its final destination in Paris. By the time he does manage to catch the train, Carmen is long gone, and she just left a present for him, one of Vile's operatives. If he had called in for backup, they might have had a better chance to catch Carmen. He has a very single-minded pursuit of Carmen, to the point where he misses obvious clues that would lead to Vile. He's also completely convinced that she's evil, despite any evidence to the contrary, which Jules typically points out. On top of what they did to Chase, I feel like the game version of Jules would not have put up with all of this nonsense. I think she would have put her foot down. But this Jules is very shy and timid and pretty soft-spoken, and most of her time is dedicated to putting up with his nonsense. Chase ends up destroying 3 cars in the season, not really because he had to, just because he's incompetent. And he doesn't seem to have a great understanding of how technology works. I guess this was done for comic relief, but comic relief characters don't have to be this incompetent. Like Sokka from Avatar: The Last Airbender, or Beast Boy from Teen Titans. Then there's ACME. They're led by the Chief, which is a great callback, but unfortunately they're pretty underwhelming. ACME isn't really a detective agency in this series. They're more like conspiracy theorists, with a really high budget. Their only interest is Vile, which they aren't even sure is real, and they say that they're the only entity that's even more secret than Vile, so ACME isn't really able to openly help people since they're a secretive organization. They decide to recruit Chase just because he managed to bring in what they suspect is a Vile operative, even though it was Carmen who left him for Interpol to find. They're trying to have a secret meeting to recruit him, but they left a literal trail that Jules was able to follow to find them because she was looking for him. It's kind of suspicious to see this busted up car and then a trail of mints leading to a supply closet. ACME shouldn't have been so careless in their recruitment process. They try to say that Jules is impressive for finding them, but really they just should have covered their tracks better. Chase and Jules end up working for them, but are they really doing anything differently that they wouldn't have been doing at Interpol? They do get fancier technology, but it doesn't matter because Chase ends up destroying 2 of their cars and then he gets yelled at. Carmen pickpockets Chase's ACME card from his jacket, which she ultimately loses to Vile. So ACME's cover ends up getting blown. And then the Chief yells at Chase, but honestly she's the one who hired him, so she should have known who she was hiring. They didn't really seem to do a background check on him, or even observe that he's a loose cannon. It seems like he wouldn't really be the best candidate for a super secret organization like this. Ultimately, ACME comes off as pretty incompetent too. I think a way they could have fixed this hero problem would be to have Jules and Chase be working for ACME to begin with. Chase could be the older, more experienced cop, but he's also pretty gruff and rough around the edges, and a bit of a loose cannon still, but way more competent, while Jules is the young, plucky, new recruit who is very smart and doesn't take any attitude. ACME's main concern can be Vile, but the main conflict of this show could be that they aren't really sure what to make of Carmen. Like, they don't know if she's really left Vile, or if maybe she's still working with Vile, like, where are her loyalties really? and they can just be trying to help people and bring down Vile. Sometimes that might mean going against Carmen, and sometimes that might even mean having to work with her. That way ACME can still be heroic, but they can also have Carmen be heroic. Then there's Zack and Ivy, the ACME agents we were following in Where on Earth is Carmen Sandiego. Here they aren't agents at all. They're basically just Carmen's friends who tag along on her adventures, helping her out whenever she needs them. They even referred to her as boss, so maybe in a way they're like her lackeys or henchmen. Their personalities have for the most part been boiled down to being from Boston. They have these really thick accents. Zack talks about food most of the time, and the two of them can unfortunately be a bit grating. Considering the fact that we already have a comic relief character with Chase, I'm not entirely sure why they needed to make Zack and Ivy like this. Another issue with Carmen being the hero is that in most Carmen Sandiego media, you were the hero. Originally, the player character was a stand-in for the audience. We never saw his face or learned anything about him, so that way it'd be easier for kids at home to insert themselves into his place. The kids who were participating in the game shows were new recruits by ACME to solve puzzles and ultimately catch Carmen Sandiego. And in the video games and cartoon, the player characters would directly help ACME to stop Carmen and get back all the treasures she stole. But here, we see his face and we know where he's from, so he's basically just another character in the show, which removes us as the hero of the story, and that's kind of disappointing for us as fans. It's done so the audience can relate more to Carmen rather than the player character. By having Carmen be more heroic, they had the player character help her out instead of the traditional heroes, which also kind of cements that the traditional heroes don't even necessarily need to be here, at least not in these few episodes. Maybe they'll play a bigger role and a more important role later on in the series, but maybe for now they should have kept this conflict more personal between Carmen and Vile, and then later introduced ACME. Like we said earlier, there's been this trend of taking villains and making them more heroic. I think a good example of this is Disney's Maleficent. In that movie, they gave one of Disney's most iconic villains this tragic backstory, and by doing so, they made her more sympathetic, but they also made the three good fairies very incompetent. They're pretty careless when they're taking care of baby Aurora. Like, there's one scene where she almost falls off a cliff and would have died, but ironically it was Maleficent who stepped in and saved her, while the fairies were off bickering amongst themselves. People often point out that in the original movie they also bickered and could be careless with their magic, but I honestly feel like at no point did they let that get in the way of them caring for her as a child, and when they were messing around with their magic, that was when they honestly believed they were out of the woods with Maleficent's curse. This ended up being a mistake, but at no point are they shown to be as reckless and incompetent as they are in the live action movie, but they had to make them more incompetent to make Maleficent look better. It's the same case here with ACME. When Chase is chasing Carmen across the rooftops, she's having no problem, but he's struggling a lot. This is probably supposed to make Carmen look cooler, but instead it just makes Chase look incompetent. It just doesn't end up looking all that impressive. She would look cool if she was able to outrun someone who actually looked like they knew what they were doing, rather than someone who's struggling so much. Ultimately, Netflix Carmen Sandiego looks very much to be a product of its time, which I know sounds kind of strange since we're living in that time, but we have a character who was an established villain turn into an aged-down hero, and we have traditional heroes being made to look like buffoons, to make our new hero look better by comparison. There is still a lot to like about this show, mostly the relationship between Carmen and Vile, and the inner workings of Vile. Vile does seem to be a very interesting organization, and there's a lot of mystery to it that seems like it'd be fun to uncover. We do, however, feel like the stuff with ACME ended up holding the show back, but that's just our opinion. Do you like this trend of villains being turned into heroes? And do you agree that it seems like the heroes are being dumbed down or made to look worse than they had been before in order to make the new heroes look better? Feel free free to leave your opinion down below. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel if you want to see more content from us. And we'll see you in the next video. Bye everyone. Bye.